Hello everybody and welcome back to the Jack Threlfall Show. We are back in the studio for episode 16 with so much to get into from all across the racing world, so let's get started. As I said in the intro, there is lots to catch up on from all across the racing world. It's a solo episode this week. We'll be back to the interview soon, but I thought it would be great to just get a solo episode in and really catch you up on all the racing action because the seasons are getting started. You know, all across the world, motorsport is back. We've had our testing periods, but now it's time to go racing again. And I think the best place to start would be America because both IndyCar and NASCAR are fully underway. We'll start with NASCAR because there have been 3 NASCAR races already. They're kind of like the NFL in that once they get started, it's bam, every weekend they're racing. You know, because it's a domestic series, they have that benefit of being able to handle the logistics and being able to move stuff around the country quickly. It enables them to set up in a very efficient, a very ordered and very structured way at every racetrack they go to, which means NASCAR is able to put on a lot of events very quickly, and it really reinstates its name in the kind of broadcast market on US television, that it's really able to put those events on consistently and well and every weekend, so it's really great for building an audience there. Now, the first NASCAR race of the season is the Daytona 500, and that was just 3 weeks ago now, but a huge, huge event in the States and really, really big for NASCAR. It's their flagship event, the Daytona 500. We spoke a little bit about it on the show, a little bit of preview, and we also reviewed the Daytona 24-hour, which is another race that happens at the same track, utilizing a kind of infield circuit that they have there. So for NASCAR, the 500 is really the epitome of their oval series racing and the flagship event of the whole calendar. It's really the biggest scale restrictor plate, kind of proper classic NASCAR style racing where it's really determined by your ability to manipulate the draft and play a real chess match for 500 miles. I mean, yeah, it's a 2.5 mile track, 500 mile race split into 3 stages. Each of those stages is worth championship points, but the overall win at the end of the 3rd stage is obviously worth the most points. But NASCAR kind of brought in these middle stages to encourage racing throughout the middle of it and make it kind of an engaging broadcast event in the middle and the start of the race, as well as the end, because it can be a problem with NASCAR in that it doesn't really get interesting until the last kind of 20, 30 minutes of the race where the strategies are kind of finalized and you see the result of everything coming to fruition. And that's really when the straight fight begins, because before that, it can be really hard to tell who's actually in the best position because it tends to be not the person leading. I mean, there's a connection between laps led and victories in NASCAR, but it's nowhere near as strong as something like Formula One or IndyCar, because NASCAR is so much about being in that draft and also so much about being in the right place at the right time, avoiding crashes, getting your fuel strategy right, because obviously this is not Formula One where you don't have refueling anymore. This is NASCAR where you have a very dynamic fuel strategy and you're able to take risks with the yellow flags because they're so frequent. It can be beneficial at times to stay out with the back of the pack or lead early on. It's really, really variable between the racetracks, and we saw a brilliant Daytona 500 this year with action throughout, and I think it really met the expectations of being that first event for these new 2022 NASCAR cars, which have massively changed since we were in Daytona last year with the NASCAR series. So it's really important for them to get a strong start to their season, not only for the drivers to build a strong start to their championship, but for NASCAR kind of as an event system and as a corporate structure to build a strong platform of racing action and high quality content and great racing action where the best driver wins, right? That's what we all want to see. And this year's Daytona 500 champion was a rookie called Austin Cindric, who was engaging in his first ever Daytona 500 to win it on his first attempt after being king of the Xfinity Series, which is kind of like the Formula 2 equivalent for NASCAR. Austin Cindric, 23 years old, was able to take the Daytona 500 checkered flag and sign that career legendary moment off so early on in his NASCAR Cup Series venture. Really, really amazing achievement for him and really, really brilliant to see him take that home. But at the same time, one of NASCAR's most popular drivers, Bubba Wallace, finished second in the Daytona 500 for the second time in his career, which is really, really tough because we know in NASCAR the margins are super, super slim. I think it was within about 200ths of a second that the race win was decided. 0.023 is the margin. Of course, it's really exciting for the viewer and obviously for the winner as well to take victories by such small margins and know that you're really racing on the limit of what's possible and you're pushing yourself to get every tiny fraction of a second out. But it's really tough at the same time to see people lose by such slim margins. I think there was a brilliant little stat that came out of that weekend that 3 of the last 6 winners of the Daytona 500 only led that last lap of the race. And of course, that's brilliant for the viewers. It's really exciting to see someone take a victory from nowhere or make a great move in the last stage of the race to claim the victory and take that historic checkered flag. But it's kind of hard to watch and hard to get involved as a fan when you know that that's going to play such a big factor. And that only the last lap or only the last 10 laps are really going to decide the race. So it's a tricky balancing act there. Of course, you can take your mind back to if you're a Formula One fan. It's not the exact same situation, but it kind of comes to mind for me in the 2010 championship finale where Sebastian Vettel didn't lead the World Championship at all in 2010 until after the final race. He didn't win any races at any times that put him at the top of the championship. Of course, he was able to build a very consistent championship challenge and put together some great results throughout that year, but he never led the championship until after the final race, which is a kind of similar thing that I think you see playing out at a little bit of a smaller scale at Daytona, right? After Daytona, NASCAR went to California to the Auto Club Speedway, and Kyle Larson took a victory there. The Chevrolets looked like the top car. And after California, NASCAR went to Vegas, went partying in Vegas last weekend, and Alex Bowman took the win there, another Chevrolet, winning on the top of the podium, and it's really looking like a strong season for them. The shorter ovals are looking to really favour the Chevrolet car at the moment. The Toyotas were strong at the 500, that's what Bubba Wallace was racing there, but it looks like the Chevrolets and the Fords have that short track speed which is so essential for building up championship points when the majority of the calendar is those kind of tracks. But what we haven't had in NASCAR yet after those first 3 races is a road course race, is a typical kind of European style road course race with left and right turns. So it'll be really interesting to see these new cars take on a challenge like that because their powertrains are so different, the handling characteristics, the chassis, the gearbox, everything's new. I think once we see those cars on a traditional road course, it'll be really interesting too to see which cars are leading the running order because it's going to be very different between the manufacturers, those handling characteristics. Having a new gearbox, new tyres, new powertrain, new chassis on these cars, a whole new design of everything really. Really improving the thermals and the aerodynamics of the car. I think it's going to be really cool to see those cars on a road course and see what the running order is going to be like then because it's a completely different challenge for the drivers when you get in that situation. And having to manage that with a new car and have a lot of drivers with a new team as well could really mix up the running order. So I'm looking forward to that later in the year. That's coming soon in the NASCAR season, so keep your eyes out for that. But now we've touched on NASCAR, I think we should also look at the IndyCar opening race because the St. Petersburg, Florida Grand Prix, the first IndyCar race of the season, I would say it wasn't equally as interesting as the Daytona 500, but it was a pretty cool race and it was exciting to see the IndyCars back out on track again. Obviously, the headline for me in IndyCar this year is Romain Grosjean's move to Andretti. Andretti are up there with Roger Penske's team and with Chip Ganassi as one of the kind of legacy IndyCar teams who you would expect more often than not to be super competitive and be within the fight for the championship every year. So Romain Grosjean's move to that team is really significant for him because it reflects their confidence in his ability to deliver the performances needed to justify a position in one of those top cars. It's a really high level of investment and confidence and wages and money and research that goes into that, right? So it requires some real trust from Andretti towards Grosjean to let him do that job. But it was not Romain Grosjean who was able to take the checkered flag in the St. Petersburg IndyCar Grand Prix. It was Scott McLaughlin, who is a V8 Supercars champion from Australia, a Kiwi driver actually, but he drives in the Australian V8 Supercar series. He's another international transfer to IndyCar. He's with the Penske team. He's really made a great impact there as a really quick driver and really nailing down that transition between the two series. Scott took the win from pole position, so it was really on Saturday that the race was won. It's a feature of the St. Petersburg track that it's a little bit Monaco style. It's a little bit thin, quite hard to overtake through sector 2 and 3. There's not a lot of opportunities. But it's still obviously, like Monaco, a very high skill event because the walls are so close the whole time and they're driving cars that are slightly different to last year's Indy cars. No massive changes like we've seen in Formula One or in NASCAR, but slightly different changes. And for the first race to be a street race, it really puts the emphasis on that challenge of handling these new cars and leaving no margin for error because at a street track, the closer you are to the wall, the faster you're going to go. But the closer you are to the wall, the easier it is to crash and the less margin you're leaving yourself to make mistakes, to lock up the brakes, to put on the power too early and oversteer on the exit, you know. All those little inputs and interactions with the car are making it do things different ways and pushing those limits in the wrong way at a track like St. Petersburg, especially in the opening race of the season, is not going to be a good symbol for your confidence or your team spirit for the rest of that year. So it's still a really, really big test, and it's still a lot of pressure on these guys in the first race of the season. And like Grosjean, McLaughlin was in the series last year as well, building his confidence up and gaining that speed, that experience, that practice, that familiarity with the car and the style and the format of IndyCar. Scott was really showing his talent last year like Grosjean was, but it was Scott who took the win this year, and it's Scott who's really building that championship challenge. Grosjean started P5 and he lost some places throughout the race. He was slowly kind of dropping down. It didn't seem like his pace was there. Running P7 towards the end of the race, the two people in front of Grosjean had a little bit of a battle and a little bit of a coming together, allowed him to make those two places back up, pretty much going into the two final laps. So pretty lucky for him to be able to make that back up. But P5 is a really great result, especially when I think 5 or 6 people had DNFs in that race. There were yellow flags. It was a tricky race to finish. A real race of attrition there in St. Pete, but a good start for Grosjean at the same time. You know, you can't go wrong with a P5. 2021 IndyCar champion Alex Palou finished second in the 2022 St. Pete Grand Prix, so a great result for him. Obviously, I'm sure he'd love to have been on the top of the podium, but to start your championship defense out with a P2 in the first race, pretty solid, I think. And it was another Penske driver, Will Power, who rounded out the podium in St. Pete, and he put in a really great performance as well to show that the old dog still got some speed. It was really... Will Power is normally known for his qualifying speed, and that was really critical at St. Pete that put him in the position to deliver that third place home. But obviously in the race, it was that consistency, that experience, that control of the car that really allowed him to bring it home and stay out of the incidents and keep the car in one piece. The next IndyCar race coming up is at the Texas Motor Speedway. It's the first oval race of the season for 2022. And it's also going to be Romain Grosjean's first time on an oval because it was part of his contract last year that he wasn't going to do those oval races. But obviously with that move to Andretti, I think it was kind of essential for them that he was committed to do the full IndyCar series. And if he's going to put a championship challenge together, he needs the points from the oval races. And of course with IndyCar, you got to compete in the Indy 500 if you're going to take it seriously. The Indy 500, like the Daytona 500 for NASCAR, is that flagship event of the IndyCar series. It's an oval race, and you have to learn how to do that oval racing. You have to be a real specialist at it if you're going to maximize the opportunities you have in those races and put a championship challenge together. We saw Alex Palou do that across the different kinds of tracks last year. Palou was really, really versatile and really able to show his skill in every instance. And Grosjean needs to be able to emulate that if he's going to try and get anywhere near the top of this championship. I'm really looking forward to the first Indy Oval of the year. I think it's a great test for the drivers to have to go between those different styles of circuits, starting with a street track and then an oval and then a traditional track and kind of rotating back and forth between those 3 different categories of track. I think it creates a really brilliant racing series and it puts together a super competitive championship because it allows people with different specialities to work on their different weaknesses at the same time. And those weaknesses are going to mix up the grid because you're going to get some interesting action where Romain Grosjean on a traditional road course is a real specialist, a really great qualifier, great race performer there. But coming into the ovals, he might be humbled a little bit and he might really not know what he's doing compared to a lot of the more experienced drivers like Scott Dixon or Will Power, as I spoke about, or Graham Rahal, or any of these category legends. They're going to just know what to do more than he is. But at the same time, Grosjean can probably utilise his fresh set of eyes, and I'm sure he'll be able to find things and little gaps and little points where people can improve. Where that new perspective, that kind of Formula One background, that innovation, that strive for speed, no more true than in Formula One is that dedication to finding every tenth of a second. So if he can bring a bit of that spirit into a new IndyCar oval-style race at the Texas Motor Speedway, that could be really, really brilliant. So keep your eyes out for that one. All right, so now we've covered the American series, I think it's time we jump across the Atlantic over to Scandinavia and we check out Rally Sweden, which was a really brilliant event, the first snow rally of the season. You know, we saw some snow and ice and some mixed conditions at Monte Carlo, but that's a tarmac rally where the snow and ice gets involved because it's on the road. Rally Sweden is a snow rally. Snow tracks, full off-road, snow tyres, full send through the snow, flat out around the corner. That's what we want to see, and that's what Rally Sweden gives you. And it was the young Finnish superstar, Kalle Rovanperä, who was able to take the win at WRC Sweden. His speed throughout the weekend was really incredible, and his driving onboards and his technique he was using to really fly around those snowy stages. We've seen Calle's pace before, of course. This is not his first ever start in WRC, but It's clear from this weekend that he is a real star for the future, and while the sport is leaving its era of dominant French drivers named Sebastian, it might be heading into the future of a dominant Finnish driver named Kalle. You never know. But I think the next era of WRC is going to be super competitive. But all this lesson from WRC Sweden taught us is that Rovanperä is going to be right near the top whenever you're on mixed conditions or wherever you're on snowy surfaces. He's going to be a real specialist there, and he's going to be up there on the timesheets. It was a return to the top for the Toyota cars. We saw, obviously, Ford M Sport get a really, really strong result out of the Monte Carlo rally, with Sebastian Loeb winning that in one of their cars. But we know Sebastian Loeb's not competing throughout the whole season, and Toyota probably pound for pound have the best driver lineup. For Toyota to return to the top of the podium, it's really, really key to kind of justify their investment in the sport, get a bit of a reward for the team members that have been working so hard to get them back to the top after that super, super strong start from Ford M Sport. Our man, Welshman Elfyn Evans, was in the mix in the rally throughout the weekend. He was in the top 10 consistently, and it looked like he was really going to be able to bring home some points in the WRC Sweden, but unfortunately, a crash on Sunday morning took him out of contention and made his car broken beyond repair. He couldn't get it back to a service area. There was nothing left in the schedule for them to get a chance to repair that car. It couldn't have been done. And unfortunately, he comes out of WRC Sweden with a DNF, which is no good for his championship challenge, especially after a slightly disappointing Monte Carlo. Belgian driver Thierry Neuville was back on the podium in P2 at the WRC Sweden. It was really key for him to build his championship in that way and deliver some really valuable constructors' points for the Hyundai team. And in third place was another Finnish driver alongside Kalle Rovanperä on the podium. In third place was a guy called Esa-Pekka Lappi. Funny name and a really, really fast driver. Really, really exciting to watch throughout the weekend as well. Great driving on Sunday, staying out of incidents, keeping your car in one piece, keeping it on the white stuff, and moving up the leaderboard consistently while others were dropping down. Lappi was able to really lap up those points and deliver it home for the Toyota team, bringing them a 1 and a 3 from Sweden. The next rally isn't until April 21st when the WRC returns to Croatia. I'm really looking forward to the stage design there and how they're able to put a rally weekend together with that incredible landscape they've got in Croatia. Really looking forward to that one, so keep your eyes out for that, alongside the next NASCAR and the next IndyCar races. So we've touched on NASCAR, we've touched on IndyCar, and we've looked at the WRC Sweden results. I think it's time we get to MotoGP, because MotoGP is back. I couldn't be more excited for MotoGP and the big bikes to be back racing around the world. The first round of MotoGP was in Qatar last weekend, and what a race it was. Not only the dramatic win for Enea Bastianini and the Gresini team on the big bikes, but also the VR46 dominating the junior categories. I mean, we know that Valentino Rossi is gone from MotoGP. He's not a rider anymore, but his legacy will remain in the sport for the rest of its existence, and we saw that this weekend. Because in Moto 3 and Moto 2, the riders on the top of that podium were on the VR46 bikes, the Valentino Rossi Academy bikes. Really brilliant to see that team putting in the performances it needs to. I mean, they have a massive budget. Of course, they've got Valentino Rossi's name on the team, so it'll have no problem attracting sponsors and generating interest in the activities of the team. But when that pressure's on, that can be the hardest time to deliver what you actually need to. And we saw in the first round this weekend a really brilliant result in that they were able to clean sweep both Moto 2 and Moto 3 with their young Italian riders. Really, really cool. The Moto 3 race is a little bit more complicated than just a simple win for Andrea Migno, the Italian rider who ended up taking the checkered flag. Because initially it was Ayumu Sasaki, a Japanese rider, who was clear as day out in the lead. He had at least a 5-6 second gap, which in Moto 3 is absolutely unheard of. I mean, 5-6 seconds in Formula 1, no problem at all. A gap between positions, absolutely normal. But the pack racing in Moto 3, I mean, it's almost like NASCAR, the way these guys race. It's absolutely incredible in that every single corner is an overtaking opportunity. Every single inch of the track is territory. And Moto 3, you're normally in a pack of all those tiny little bikes, zipping around like little wasps, and every corner is an opportunity to push someone out the way or sit someone up or gain a position on your rival. The racing is so intense that you never really see people break away from the pack because they're always getting attacked from second place. They're really never able to build a consistent lead unless you get a little bit lucky with some incidents behind you or you have some unbelievable pace to pull away from the pack. You very, very rarely see something like that happen because Moto 3 is so competitive and those tiny little bikes are so good at generating exciting racing. But Sasaki did exactly that. He pulled away from the pack. His pace was so much better than the other people around him and it looked like he had a clear path to victory. And with about 8 laps remaining, a massive high side threw his bike up in the air, and as he landed, he deformed a part of the side body of the bike, and he had to come home. It was, I believe, just a mistake by him. Nothing's come out that it was a problem with the bike. He never said that in any of the interviews. So just a massive high side, and then when he landed back down, that impact back with the track damaged the bike. He's out there in first, and then suddenly the problem kicks in with the bike. It's not running how it's meant to. Lap times start dropping down. Everyone from second back to 15th overtakes you, and Sasaki ended up having to pull into the pits because it wasn't safe for him to be riding with the damage on his bike. You can call it harsh, but at the end of the day, it was his mistake that took him out of the race, so justice maybe was served there, I'm not sure. But following from Sasaki's woes, it was Andrea Migno that was able to take the win there, and it was really key for him to deliver under all that pressure of being in the VR46 team, take that checkered flag at the first race of the season. Amazing for him, really, really cool. The Moto2 race was a little bit less action-packed. It was a rider called Celestino Vietti who took the checkered flag in that race. Of course, as I've already mentioned, he was on another VR46 bike, a different bike, of course, because it's in Moto2. But with a similar team and part of that same driver development structure with the VR46 team. So him putting in that performance and he's able to build a championship challenge off of that could be a MotoGP seat in the future for Celestino Vietti. Who knows? All eyes from the kind of British broadcast perspective are on Jake Dixon and Sam Lowes this year in Moto2. Those are the real standout stars we're looking towards as our British kings of the podium, hopefully. We saw Sam Lowes finish third in this race, which was a really great result for him. I think a bit of an up and down weekend for him. He'd made some mistakes in the warm-up and in practice and in qualifying, sitting up on the bike quite often and not being able to deliver the laps with the confidence that you need in MotoGP. But similar to the way that Romain Grosjean was able to make up places by taking advantage of people battling in front of him at the end of the IndyCar opening race, similar kind of effect happened for Sam Lowes because he was able to finish third on the podium after the two riders in front of him got involved in their own battle. He skipped up from 5th to 3rd on the final lap. So great combination there, showing at the end of that race a little bit of a combination of bravery and luck and skill and experience to put yourself in the position to take advantage of someone else's mistakes. But a great result for Sam Lowes there. Hopefully he can build a championship challenge like we've spoke about for the rest of the races in the episode. And in Moto2 this year, we also have Pedro Acosta, who is the 2021 Moto3 champion, who was a real standout rider of that championship last year. He was amazing in Moto3. So for him to make that jump up to Moto2, all eyes are going to be on him at every race this year, looking to see whether he can stand up to that pressure on that top KTM bike. Unfortunately for Acosta, he was sat up on the first lap of the race and he didn't have the opportunity to stay with the pack there, and he was pushed to the back of the field. So it was a real race of recovery and attrition for him, trying to make up places from the back of the field. But if we know anything about Pedro Acosta, and especially anything about his riding skill at Doha and that Qatar track, we know he has the ability to come from the back of the pack and really make up a lot of places. It was famous, one of the things that put Pedro Acosta on the map in Moto3 last year. Because of a qualifying penalty, he started a race in pit lane, and he went on to win that race, and that was at the Qatar track in Moto3 last year. So really eyes were on him as to see whether he could emulate a little bit of the spirit and the skill and the technique shown in that recovery ride last year. He could do that a little bit again this year because he was at the back of the pack again in that Moto2 bike. Unfortunately for Acosta, the racing style in Moto2 isn't exactly the same as MotoGP. You have a little bit more of an interaction with aerodynamics and dirty air, and pack racing isn't as possible as it is on Moto3 bikes, so the pace at the front wasn't going to enable Acosta to catch them up in any meaningful way. But after that first lap and being in last place, Acosta was able to make his way all the way back up to P12. Realistically, that's still championship points. It's still good enough of a recovery to signify that skill is there. And also in your first race of the season with a new team, to show that going to the back of the field or being involved in an incident and being pushed back to the lower end of the running order is not going to destroy your whole weekend, and it's not something to get wound up over. It's not something to lose all hope over. You know your rider is going to have that skill to pull a recovery ride out. So if Acosta can improve that qualifying performance and get himself a little bit more secure on the first laps and be less involved with those incidents, the pace is there and the skill is there, and the championship challenge is potentially underway for Acosta too. If he can get some more points towards the top end of the podium in the latter races. Of course, it's a long season. It's really hard to make predictions off the first race. And one thing you can definitely extrapolate from that race is that Pedro Acosta looked amazingly strong and amazingly quick in that bike. And if he can avoid incidents like the winners were, stay in that fight until the end of the race on a Moto2 bike, could be back-to-back rookie championships. It could be a Marc Marquez for the future. Who knows? Let's wait and see. So we've covered the junior categories there, and I think now it's time we get to MotoGP, we get to the results of the big bikes. And as I said, it was Enea Bastianini for the Gresini team who took the top step of the podium after a really, really interesting race. Initially, it was the Hondas that were leading. It was Marquez and Espargaro near the top. But tyre degradation kicked in, and I think the balance of the Honda isn't quite worked out yet. Marquez has spoken about how he obviously likes his bikes to be extremely tailored to him, and for a long time in that Honda team, he was able to dictate all the engineering to be specialised to what he would like, and it was always quite hard for his teammates to adapt to that. But with Marquez's injury, it's not exactly the same situation because he's not as fast as he used to be. He's not the champion of last season. You know, we have Mir and Quartararo now as the sort of changing of the guard, the new guys who are near the top of the running order. So Marquez isn't really able to dictate the engineering in the way that he used to, and it seems like the balance of that Honda bike, while it was a little bit better for Espargaro and he was able to lead near the top of the race, for both of them, it didn't really feel like it was able to deliver the pace it needed to stay near the front. Now, on the other hand, the Suzukis looked rapid. It was Joan Mir and Alex Rins and the Suzuki bikes that were able to finish, I think, P5 and P6 in this race. It's a great result for them. Obviously, you would like to be a little bit higher up the podium more often than not. You're never going to win a Constructors' Championship finishing P5 and P6 every time. But what it does do is put them in a pretty good place when you have both bikes able to show that the pace is there. It's a pretty clear sign that your equipment is where it needs to be, and a lot of teams have said the Suzuki looks the strongest all-round bike. The Doha track in Qatar is normally Yamaha territory, and it was a little disappointing from Yamaha this year, I think especially for Fabio Quartararo, our reigning champion. At a track where Yamaha were expected to be near the top, obviously those expectations can precede them and detract from their overall performance. But that didn't feel like what was happening. It felt instead like the Yamaha really just was that slow, and it wasn't like people were putting an unfair expectation on them. The expectation was earned because they had been quick at the track before, so when they're not able to deliver something that they've been clearly able to deliver before, whose fault is that? Probably not Quartararo, and then if it isn't Quartararo's fault, whose is it? Who's not providing him with the equipment he needs to be near the top, right? That's a big problem for the Yamaha team looking into the next race in Indonesia. It was KTM rider Brad Binder that finished second behind Enea Bastianini. It was a really great ride for Binder. We saw him take a win in 2020 and a win in 2021 at the incredible Austrian Grand Prix last year. But for Binder, it had really been key for him to improve on his qualifying performance, but also show that his race pace is always going to be there and he's always going to be competitive when the opportunities are available. It's been a weakness of his, that qualifying pace, but the race pace has always been there. He was in the mix for a lot of the race. It didn't seem like he had the basic pace in the bike to overtake the Hondas. It just felt like the KTM was a little bit too on edge, that he wasn't going to be able to match the early race pace of the Hondas, but he was in a firm third for a while there. And then once the tyre degradation started kicking in and it really got mixed up, Honda started dropping back and Bastianini really started rushing forward on that 2021 Ducati. Bastianini was really the star of the weekend, but Binder, you know, he showed some consistency there and he showed that he was going to be able to manage those tyres when tyre wear comes into it, as it did in the Qatar Grand Prix. It can be a little bit harder to manage your tyres in MotoGP because beyond Formula 1, it's so much focused on the angle of the tyre and managing which bit of the tyre you're in contact with the track with. It's kind of more of a three-dimensional exercise when you're leaning, you're pushing the bike around these different corners. It's really, really engaging. It's really, really high skill to be the guy that can pull the speed out of the tyres and manage them in the right way. That racecraft for Binder, real skill. But I think it's time now we reflect a little bit on the history of MotoGP and what a win really means for the Gresini team, because it had been a long time since they'd been anywhere near the top step of that podium. They'd been able to deliver a good performance last year running the Aprilia bikes at the 2021 British Grand Prix. The Gresini team was able to deliver Aprilia's first podium in the sport, and it was a really key moment for them to achieve that, of course, especially after the loss of their founder, Fausto Gresini, at the start of 2021. But beyond that, the Gresini team has always had a tricky past with death and tragedy and inspirational moments in response to that. So I'm going to kind of reflect on here as some of the facts and the stats about the Gresini team and some of their history to really put Bastianini's win in context there, because I feel like they've been a really key part of MotoGP's development. And while they're not a Ducati, they're not a Honda, it's been really cool to see how they've developed throughout the years and how they've responded to such tragedy, especially with the loss of Marco Simoncelli. Many people will know that he was a great name in the sport of MotoGP and a real close personal friend of Valentino Rossi. I mean, Rossi, of course, has been a mentor to every MotoGP rider to some extent, especially the young Italian ones. But to Simoncelli, it was more than that. It was a really close personal connection. And if you don't know, Marco Simoncelli died in a crash at the 2011 Malaysia Grand Prix. It was a huge loss for MotoGP. Of course, the subject of death and loss and tragedy at a racetrack is intertwined with the history of motorsport, but it's also very difficult to know the right things to say. But I'll kind of do my best to give you a full context of how the Gresini team came to be and what it really meant for them to return to the top of the sport. So Fausto Gresini was a World Championship rider himself on the 125cc bikes in the late 90s. He was a double world champion, obviously not in the biggest category of bikes, not in 500cc, not on the top category. But on those little bikes, he was a world champion. And after he retired from racing, he thought, let me start my own race team and see if I can help the next generation of riders find some success as a team principal. So he starts Gresini Racing. And the first big signing for Gresini Racing in their success in MotoGP was a Japanese rider called Daijiro Kato, who was a 2002 Rookie of the Year on the big bikes and a really key figure, quick, young Japanese rider who was really delivering the points home for the Gresini team. They were using the Honda bikes at the time. It had been a long-term partnership between Gresini and Honda. And they had formed a really good partnership, and it was a team that had attracted the talent of Daijiro Kato to Gresini, and it looked like that was going to be a great partnership. In 2002, Kato won Rookie of the Year with Gresini, and it just looked like that partnership was really, really building into something special. And in 2003, the team was so successful, they were able to attract the talents of Sete Gibernau, who became a long-time rival of Valentino Rossi, and Gibernau went on to finish P2 in the MotoGP Championship, I think 3 times behind Rossi. Really, really amazing result when you consider, of course, the greatness of Valentino Rossi. To finish near that and to put some kind of championship challenge in throughout that era of dominance is really, really commendable for Gibernau and the Gresini team. But 2003 is the first year in our little history lesson where we have to face that unescapable tragedy of motorsport, because Daijiro Kato lost his life in a crash in 2003 at the Japanese Grand Prix. The loss of Kato was, of course, felt throughout the world of Japanese motorsport and the wider world of motorsport in general. It's always horrible when a situation like that happens, but when it's a young, rising star with so much talent in the future, so much potential, a really tough moment of reality there for the Gresini team. But the weekend after that, they demonstrated that spirit of being able to rise from the darkness, to rise from the tragedy. And Gibernau went on to win not only the race after, but the weekend after that loss, to internalize that and push those emotions aside and deliver a winning performance in that Valentino Rossi dominant Yamaha era. A massive moment for the Gresini team, a hugely emotional moment to demonstrate that their competitiveness, their love for racing was unwavering, and their dedication to speed and being at the top of the sport was really honouring the memory of that lost rider, that tragic, tragic moment, with inspiration and with a truly, truly heroic sporting performance. And as I mentioned earlier, it was after that dramatic win in 2003 that Sete Gibernau went on to become a really key figure in the MotoGP paddock and a massive rival for Valentino Rossi, placing second in the MotoGP World Championship. 2003, 4, 5, and I believe 2006 as well. Unfortunately, after that year's and after Gibernau's competitiveness, some changes in the sport and some changes in the funding structure of MotoGP and sponsorship deals for Gresini. And in the following years, the competitiveness of the Gresini team just fell a little bit, and they weren't able to be near the top of many of the world championships, whether it be on the big bike or in the junior categories. And in 2010, Marco Simoncelli arrives with the Gresini team and starts racing and reigniting a little bit of that passion that Kato exemplified in his style as a young, dramatic, super quick rider, super competitive. It felt like Simoncelli captured that, and he was bringing that spirit back to the Gresini team. And for the 2011 season, it looked like Simoncelli had the right bike. It looked like he was competitive enough to be fighting for wins. Of course, it can't be left out of the history books that Simoncelli's riding style was a little bit like Marc Marquez ended up being in terms of it was controversial and incident heavy, and a lot of times where incidents were deemed to be his fault. But despite that, it's undeniable that Simoncelli was fast and he was competitive and he was better than a lot of the other riders in that category at that time, if a little bit unwieldy and a little bit hard to control and a little bit loose in his riding style. Undeniably a brilliant rider and making a clear impact in the top category of motorbike racing, Marco Simoncelli was clearly a star for the future, and a star that, as I had mentioned earlier, was closely aligned with the stardom of Valentino Rossi and the inspiration that Rossi brought to Italy in being that exemplary figure at the top of bike racing and a real champion, a figure for the sport. Being associated with Simoncelli put a lot of pressure on Simoncelli, but really drew that sponsorship attention. It really drew that media narrative to the fact that this guy might be the one for the future of Italian motorsports. But as I mentioned earlier, it was at the 2011 Motorcycle Grand Prix of Malaysia that Marco Simoncelli lost his life, just like Kato did at that Suzuka race. Gresini's star for the future was taken from them in the most tragic of fashions in front of the world. After Simoncelli's death in the 2011 season, Gresini really struggled to return any of that competitiveness in the later years beyond that. They really couldn't find a way to return to the top of the podium again like Simoncelli had done for them. It was a really tricky time for the team, and I'm sure questions were asked over their future and whether they could stay in the sport with that string of uncompetitiveness. It was not until 2018 that a world title returned to Gresini when they took a 1-2 in the Moto 3 category, with future MotoGP rider Jorge Martin winning that for them. That success in the junior categories spoke to another resurgence in performance for the team and another real key step in bringing those sponsors back and bringing that passion for the Gresini team back into MotoGP, showing that given the right equipment, given the right sponsors, given the right riders, they could still deliver great results. That renewed success in the junior motorcycle racing categories was a great step for the team and really significant in demonstrating value to their sponsors and showing that it was really possible for them to return to the top step of the podium. But tragedy never strayed far from the Gresini team, and unfortunately in February 2021, the team principal of that team, Fausto Gresini, lost his life after a battle with coronavirus, and his widow, Nadia Padovani, took over that team principal role, and it was really key for the Gresini team to show that Fausto's legacy would be honoured through the continuation of that team's participation in motorcycle racing, and that their success could be dedicated to him. That passion for the team and that drive to push themselves to be the best they could be, not only for the riders and Nadia, the team principal, but everyone in that team must have felt a little bit of that spirit come through, and they had a new figure, a new legacy, a new higher force that they were working for. And a key decision that Nadia made that really played into the competitiveness of the team and the result that we saw in Doha last weekend, the win for Enea Bastianini on the Gresini bike, was moving from Aprilia as their manufacturer to Ducati and to ride the 2021 Ducati bike. Last year's Ducati bike, obviously the top Ducati team get the new equipment and the customer teams get last year's bikes, right? So Bastianini was riding last year's Ducati bike set up by the Gresini team, so a lot goes into setting that bike up in the way Bastianini wants it, and it's really key for them to get that right. But the equipment is actually last year's Ducati bike, which is still legal to enter, but it might not have all the same upgrades, it might not have all the same power delivery or handling or whatever that the factory team is going to have on their bike, right? So it's tricky to enter a competitive bike when you're running last year's equipment. But it seems now that the move to Ducati was definitely the right one, and it was really clear that Ducati are going to be able to deliver a bike that is going to be hugely, hugely competitive. And the straight line speed that Ducati have is going to be useful at every single track on the calendar. It's a really, really key feature of that bike, that it's absolutely rapid in a straight line. And for Bastianini and that Gresini team, they were able to utilise that to take the win in Qatar. What a moment for them to return again to the top step of the podium after the loss of Fausto and Nadia's leadership taking over that team. Amazing to see her back on the top of that podium with her rider. And with all the emotions and the history behind that victory and all the context with the development and the tragedy and the victory and the inspiration of that Gresini team, I think it really illuminates just the beauty and the passion in motorsport. The meaning that we see on that podium, the emotions throughout the whole Gresini team and Ducati as well, honouring the legacy of Fausto with that win. As much as it's tragic that Fausto wasn't there to witness it himself, I'm sure he would have loved it. There's a beauty and a poetry in that loss and that celebration of legacy there in racing and through sporting performance. I think is really what makes it so emotional. What a weekend it was for MotoGP in Qatar, full of stories throughout the paddock, lots of emotions there and some really brilliant sporting performances. Next for MotoGP, we have the Indonesia Grand Prix, a new track there nestled right on the coastline of Indonesia, a really, really beautiful track. I'd really recommend looking it up and getting the views of that track in. I can't wait to see the bikes flying around there, and I hope we get some more great racing action. But I think with that we can conclude our review of the world's racing action and look to the future, because we have the Formula 1 Bahrain test coming up this weekend. A really key event for the Formula 1 teams to put together their 2022 championship cars and understand these new regulations to the best of their ability, coming up with all kinds of new parts and little aero devices on the cars and little loopholes and engineering techniques to throw around every single chance they have of finding some exploit in the regulation. It's really key for the teams that they maximise opportunities in testing, because there is an opportunity cost to everything, and you're spending time every minute that you could be spending on another part of the car, or you could be spending doing something else, or the driver could be spending doing something else, right? Of course, the headlines at the moment with regards to testing are surrounding the Haas team. We've just had the announcement, actually, while I was recording this podcast, that Kevin Magnussen is going to be joining the Haas team for 2022, taking Nikita Mazepin's seat. I think Magnussen's a really, really interesting choice for that drive, because he's obviously a driver with much more experience, particularly experience with the Haas team. For Schumacher then to be measured against the skills of Kevin Magnussen, it's really, I think, going to push him further in his driver development, because of course with Mazepin it was a very different situation, a different teammate dynamic there. A lot of the context for this discussion of the Haas driver pairing will depend on how competitive Haas are in general next year, but I think that partnership of Mick Schumacher and Kevin Magnussen is a really, really interesting one, and if the Haas car is competitive, it could be a really great partnership. I think Magnussen is going to be a kind of interesting figure for Schumacher to learn from. Magnussen's learnt a lot of lessons the hard way in Formula 1, but he is genuinely a quick driver. He is someone who is going to be kind of better than a lot of the other pay drivers we see in the sport. But of course, we will have to wait and see as to whether Magnussen is the right choice for Haas. It's a really tricky situation they're in the moment with the makeup of their sponsorships and their funding structure. Of course, it's not where it needs to be. More than anything, it seems like a massive opportunity for Magnussen that's kind of fell in his lap a little bit to demonstrate that he deserves to be in Formula 1. I think that's going to be the real test for him. If he can significantly beat Schumacher and put a real margin on him and show that he's not the real wonder boy that everyone thinks he is. And as we spoke about earlier, motorsport is a lot about maximising opportunities. So for Magnussen, if he can really maximise this opportunity with Haas for the 2022 season and demonstrate that it was wrong to drop him from the sport, show that he is one of those really top open-wheel drivers, beating someone like Schumacher, an F2 champion, is really going to raise his stock. Of course, he was pretty closely matched with Grosjean when they were teammates at Haas, but it's a different time and a different set of regulations. And I think Magnussen, with that time out, he's going to have to realise how special it is to be back in Formula 1, and he's going to have to maximise that opportunity if he's going to get anything out of it really significant, beyond just being a reserve driver for that Haas team, because I think Haas need more than that if they're going to survive in Formula 1. I think with that, we can wrap up this week's episode of the Jack Threlfall Show. It's been really great to get back into the studio, get a good solo episode down and cover all the history from the world of motorsport and catch up on all that great racing action. Now the 2022 seasons are all getting underway. I'm really looking forward to a brilliant year of racing. There's action all across the world in motorsport this weekend, and I'll be back in the studio next week to break it all down for you. But for now, I'll let the outro song play, and this has been the Jack Threlfall Show.